Extreme temperatures are no longer a one day, 1 week, or 1 month phenomenon. If there is one thing that unites our divided world, is that we are all increasingly feeling the heat.
What's behind those record temperatures and what can be done about it? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. More than 1,600 places across the globe tied or broke heat records in the past few weeks, according to the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Scientists say it's the hottest the planet has been in about 120,000 years, the result of human-caused climate change. And as UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres tells us, it comes with deadly consequences.
Heat is estimated to kill almost 500,000 people a year, and that's about 30 times more than tropical cyclones. We know what it is driving it: fossil fuel-charged, human-induced climate change. And we know it's going to get worse. Extreme heat is the new abnormal. But the good news is that there are solutions.
Okay, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Changhua serves as chair of the Asia-Pacific Water Forum's Governing Council. Bob Ward is the Policy and Communications Director at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. Also with us is Michael K. Dorsey. He heads Arizona State University's Walton Sustainability Solutions Service. And Sweta Chakraborty is right here in the studio with us. She's a risk and behavioral scientist and the CEO of U.S. operations for the climate advocacy group We Don't Have Time. Thanks everyone for being with us. Sweta, let's start right here in the studio. So let's look at what's been happening over the past few years. You had the Paris Accords where there was agreement that the rise in temperatures needed to be limited to under 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial levels. Well, it's breached that, and it's breached it very quickly. So what's behind this very rapid increase in temperatures?
This is what scientists have been predicting now for decades. Everything is falling into line, and nobody wanted to be right here, but at the same time, nobody's surprised. If we didn't get in control of the fossil fuel burning that was causing increased carbon emissions into our atmosphere, this was going to be the unfortunate outcome, and we're seeing it now in real time. The impacts of climate are happening and speeding up, happening actually faster than many scientists predicted. So we saw 2023 as the hottest summer on record. 2024 is on its way to break that record. 2,300 Americans died last year from heat. 70,000 Europeans died last year from heat. And this doesn't get reported as much as some of these other climate change impacts like hurricanes, for example, because it's so much more dramatic, right? You see anchors in the middle of the eye of the hurricane and they're holding onto trees for dear life or whatnot. But heat is actually way more dangerous. It's that silent, invisible killer. And that's the type of impact on climate that we need to get a grip on. Otherwise, it's going to be a runaway risk. And these are the kinds of things that we anticipate, have anticipated, and it's really coming time now to get ahead of it, as we know this trend is only going to increase in frequency and severity.
Yeah, it has been underreported, and I guess we don't recognize the enormity of the crisis that we're facing when you tell us 70,000 people in Europe died. But as we heard the UN Secretary General just tell us a moment ago, that there is some good news, there are solutions. What are the solutions?
The solutions come from multilateral talk. So, like you said, the Paris Accords is where the countries came together to really set a maximum temperature that the world can reach. And so we really need to continue to work together to stay under that threshold. Obviously, we're surpassing it, but we can put a new benchmark in place and really work hard now that we are in the midst of these impacts and people are increasingly aware because they're experiencing it. So this is the time for countries to show up and to really to not just show up, but to actually show how they are going to implement the various policies that they promised to keep that global temperature warming under control.
Right, because there's no enforcement mechanism, is there?
Well, that's really what the ultimate issue is, right?
Yeah.
So we need leaders, we need America, we need China, we need Brazil, we need India, the biggest polluters, to actually showcase how they're going to do it so that countries can fall into line. We'll shame countries if we need to, we'll hold countries accountable. That will be the enforcement mechanism.
Right. Michael Dorsey, as I said earlier on, more than 1,600 places tied or broke heat records in the Northern Hemisphere over the past few weeks. Scientists, of course, are telling us, and as we just heard, this is being caused by human behavior. President Biden entered office promising to end drilling. Instead, it is booming under his watch and has now outpaced the former Trump administrations in the number of drilling permits that have been approved. Why has it been so difficult to change this kind of behavior? I mean, it's human behavior, corporate behavior, and as I just said, government behavior.
Well, Anna, thanks so much for having me. You're absolutely right. There are new and more permits for oil and gas drilling activity in the United States. But at the same time, we're now on the cusp of seeing some of the largest investments in solar and wind energy as well. We're on course to top $2 trillion invested in solar and wind this year. That's record-breaking. That beats the previous years almost by double. We're only seeing a couple of years when we've had north of $1 trillion invested in wind and solar, renewable resources. So we are on the right course. We've got to continue to break down and slow down the investments in fossil fuel technology. But solar and wind are passing those by, and that's really a part of the solution. That's going to deliver us to reducing the carbon pollution that we see driving rising temperatures and record heat around the world.
Right, I want to talk about those alternative sources of energy in a moment, but let me get to Bob Ward. Bob Ward, Europe is heating up twice as quickly as the rest of the planet. That's according to the United Nations as well as Europe's Copernicus Climate Change Service. And of course, this is having health consequences. It's having economic consequences. We just heard from Sweta telling us that 70,000 Europeans died because of heat last year. Let's listen to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres again. Let's listen to him.
Heat stress at work is projected to cost the global economy $2.4 trillion by 2030, up from $280 billion in the mid-90s. We need measures to protect workers grounded in human rights, and we must ensure that laws and regulations reflect the reality of extreme heat today and are enforced. Third, we must massively boost the resilience of economies and societies using data and science.
So, Bob, we heard some of the consequences of the planet heating up. I mean, if we look at one of those consequences, food prices have gone up in the United Kingdom, for instance, because of climate change. But when you look at this broadly, what kind of impact is it having on the daily lives of people?
Well, as you've noted, in 2022, it was actually summer 2022 when we had around 70,000 deaths across Europe. We had temperatures that exceeded 40 degrees in places like Paris and London, which was extraordinary. We didn't expect it to happen this quickly. And this is one thing we have to realize. This will all get worse until the world gets to net zero emissions of greenhouse gases, right? And we're nowhere near that at the moment. At the moment, annual emissions are going up. So until we get to net zero emissions, it gets worse. So we're going to have to learn to adapt to this increasing heat. That means protecting the most vulnerable. Most of the people who died in Europe in 2022 were older people with underlying health conditions. On their death certificates, it usually wasn't heat that was listed, but we know that heat was the trigger. It's absolutely critical, particularly in cities, that we protect vulnerable people, because the combination of air pollution and heat is what kills people. And we're killing tens of thousands of people across Europe. We're killing hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people every year across the world. And it's going to get worse, and we're going to have to learn to protect these people and find ways of keeping people safe, stopping them from living in overheated homes where most people die. They're neglected. They die because of neglect.
So, Bob, from what I'm hearing, I mean, this is an urgent crisis that we are facing right now. And as you point out, the most vulnerable people are the people already with some kind of underlying health issue. I mean, we had that experience with COVID, where people with underlying health issues had to be looked after very, very quickly. Why isn't that happening when it comes to this crisis?
Well, I think at the moment, people don't realize the scale of the damage. I heard a figure of like 2,000 or 3,000 people dying in the United States from heat. That's a complete underestimate. You're not counting the number of people who die everywhere in the United States every year through the effects of heat. It's much likely to be in the tens of thousands. You can take measures to make sure these people look after themselves better. That means making sure their homes have shutters to keep out the sunlight in the middle of the day. It means making sure that they have adequate ventilation in their homes, and it means moving them out of the homes altogether if their homes are overheating. We just got to start taking this. Imagine if you killed tens of thousands of people every year through flooding in the United States. There'd be an uproar, but you're killing tens of thousands of people every year with heat in Europe and in the United States, and we just kind of go, oh, well, what should we do? It's wrong. It's just wrong.
Changhua, let's talk about the situation in China right now. China has actually just been experiencing extreme weather patterns. You've had torrential rains. 30 people have been killed, and these rains and the flooding that accompanied the rains has been triggered by Typhoon Gayami. Thousands of people have been evacuated from a lot of these areas. I mean, what can you tell us about the human cost in China of these extreme weather patterns and how the government is moving to cope with this?
Well, like any other part of the world, China definitely has been suffering much more frequent, more intense extreme weather events. As you mentioned just now, China this year has definitely experienced record-breaking droughts in the northern part, central part of the country, but also through the typhoon and Gayami, and particularly in the southeast and the eastern part of the country, experiencing extreme flooding. And I think that the country is still in a recuperating sort of, state at this very moment. The damages, besides the people, killed by typhoon, the disasters there, if you look at deeper into, farmland, and basically for China, food security is a very important issue. And the droughts, flooding definitely been damaging the farmlands and missed the season. And so you could imagine the consequences will be there. And Shanghai at this moment is literally experiencing 40 degrees Celsius above temperature at this moment. Still, it's going on. We'll see the numbers, official numbers coming out probably down the road, and after everything actually is wrapping up. But in the meantime, the country has been learning really, really hard in terms of early warning systems, emergency response, and more and more importantly, figuring out how to enhance the infrastructure and resilience capability to make sure we manage, reduce, and prevent loss as much as possible. But in the meantime, we have to bear the cost and consequences like any other parts of the world. Now there is the other side. China definitely has been investing heavily in clean energy transition, and which is fascinating to see. China's efforts in terms of reducing reliance on coal. But now the difficult situation is that while we've been investing heavily in renewable energy, clean energy, but in the meantime, the losses, costs actually for climate disasters have been rising. So that's a really difficult sort of financing issue, right? How much money is out there really to make sure we, on one side, will be able to increase, investment in clean energy transition, reduce reliance on fossil fuels, but in the meantime, we have to make sure that we will be able to do a good job to manage the loss, reduce the loss and damages actually, and also suffering of the people. That's really a new issue on the table for all the decision makers actually to learn, and also to learn how to make, balanced decisions down the road.
Right, Changhua, well, you make the point that China's making efforts, very vigorous efforts, in fact, to transition, the clean energy transition. We did have President Xi Jinping who promised that China will try to peak emissions by 2030 and then try to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. And of course, the country is a leader now in green technology and alternative sources of energy like wind energy, solar energy as well. Are you seeing any of those benefits right now?
Well, definitely, I think from the clean energy perspective, we definitely have experienced, for instance, reduced air pollution. That's really obvious achievement actually delivered so far by investing in clean energy and reduce reliance on coal. That's so obvious. But in the meantime, as I said, put China's efforts in terms of energy transition in the bigger context of global, planet-wide global warming, and somehow it's sort of, compromising in a way, say, okay,
right.
Yes, we could invest in, but sometimes we have to learn how to adapt to climate change there as well. One thing I think positively in terms of reducing emissions perspective, China is definitely on this track, and a lot of researchers started to come out saying very possibly China is either reached peaked its emissions or getting very, very close to peaking its emissions. Hopefully that's going to be another milestone. We're going to achieve the target ahead of the schedule, and hopefully somehow we'll be able to accelerate the progresses of transition, at least actually from reducing reliance on coal perspective. That's going to be huge progress.
Sweta, I mean, given this ongoing trend that we've been talking about here, I mean, are there going to be places on Earth that are going to be uninhabitable? I mean, are we already there?
We're getting there. Yeah. And the cities close to the equator and the lower latitudes are becoming increasingly inhospitable to human life. The reason for that is because the temperatures are just soaring. I'm talking about cities like Dubai, where the recent COP conference was held that the UN hosted. And I'm talking about places like Kuwait City. The temperatures feel like 150 degrees Fahrenheit for those of us in the United States that use Fahrenheit still. And these places are not hospitable to human life for much longer. We have got to get a grip on this. The reality is that we need to adapt. As Bob said, we need to get ahead of what we know is already here and what's coming and make some of these cities hospitable to human life again. To do that, we need energy, we need cooling. And to have cooling, and this is this vicious cycle we're in, we need energy to cool us at the same time that energy is making the planet hotter. So how do we do that? We do that through nuclear power. And I know my colleague on this panel never likes when I make this comment, but the reality is renewables will not get us there at the moment. There's not enough storage for renewables, and it will not cover that base load of energy needed for our cooling needs to keep human populations safe at these soaring temperatures, particularly in places close to the equator like Dubai and Kuwait.
Right. I mean, you talk about places like Dubai and Kuwait, but there are also communities along that equatorial belt that are not going to be able to afford things like energy to cool their environments, and then I mean, the alternative for them would be to leave the areas where they are staying. And this is going to create this other challenge of climate refugees.
And this is where diplomacy comes in. So we need technology. We need this transition to clean energy. And this is what we took away in Dubai from the COP28 conference. We said that nuclear needs to be part of the taxonomy of energy, and we need to move away from fossil fuels. That's one aspect of this. We also need to fund those most vulnerable to be able to survive, to be able to recover if that option even exists. But ultimately, it's diplomacy. How do we move masses of people so that they preserve their culture, their identity, and their integrity? This is a human dignity issue, and it really requires close collaborations at the highest echelons of governance to be able to move people not just 100 miles away from where they live. That's not going to do it. But historically, that's the most that people would move. Now we're talking about moving people to entirely different geographic locations, and you're right to say that this is something we need to closely watch.
Right. Michael Dorsey, talking about solutions, I think that was a reference to you that Sweta made a moment ago when she talked about nuclear energy being one of those solutions. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have no truck in the game, but physics, politicians, and people absolutely are against Sweta and the whole idea of deploying nuclear at scale. It's not happening. It's not going to happen anytime soon, and we're not going to be there anytime soon because of just the engineering challenges, the politicians that don't move it fast enough, and really polities and people that are opposed to having those facilities in their own backyard. The reality is that future energy is really not just about wind and solar. It's about 4 key things that are part of that. It's certainly wind and solar generation and scaling it up, and China is absolutely leading in doing that. But it's also about storage. It's also about energy efficiency, particularly more efficient panels and more efficient large-scale wind turbines. And it's about digital data and moving electrons really strategically in the grid and across the grid. That's really the future of energy. Those 4 areas are the things that are going to help us scale renewables and are actually driving the incredible multi-trillion-dollar investments that we're already seeing in the renewable space. And those things are leave nuclear well back in the 20th century where it belongs is really a very expensive way to boil water, nothing more.
Right, Michael, one more thing about, the impact that this is having on people, on human beings. I mean, if we look at some areas, all over the world, we have people who work out in the open. These are construction workers, for instance, fishermen work out in the open. They're going to be affected by these extreme levels of heat. And, we talked a moment ago about mitigation, about adaptation. Is there are the finances there to help them when they can't actually be doing their jobs any longer?
The funding and the resources aren't there at the scale that they need to be, nor are they there for those on the margins that are going to see and are already seeing increased mortality and morbidity from rising temperatures. It's those that are poor, less well off, those that spend not just an hour or so, but the full day outside in really high temperatures that are harmed first and most. And we need to put more resources to protect those on the margins. And we also need to put more resources to deal with large cities and so forth, but also places like small islands that are suffering the brunt from not just the heat, but also rising seas and so forth. So we need to put much more money, especially to protect those on the margins of society.
Right, Bob Ward, here's another interesting little fact that we came across during our research on this program, and that is that ground temperatures are soaring in East Antarctica. They're soaring 28 degrees Celsius above normal levels. It's the middle of winter there right now, so temperatures are still below freezing, about -4 Celsius. But what can you tell us about these soaring temperature levels and the impact they're having?
Yeah, so one of the products of global warming as we're experiencing it is that at the poles, the level of warming is higher than at the tropics. What that means is that the melting of the ice in the, particularly in the land-based ice sheets in Greenland and particularly in West Antarctica, are particularly vulnerable. And that should worry us, because if you talk about the amount of ice in Greenland and West Antarctica, if it all slides into the ocean, it will collectively raise sea levels by 13 meters around the world. Now, that's not going to happen overnight, but that's a trend that's starting to happen, and it's going to be extremely difficult for us to adapt to those kinds of impacts.
Changhua, where do you see the negotiations to meet this challenge going from here? I mean, we talked about the Paris Accords. There have been several other meetings after that as well. But how do you see negotiations going, especially between China and the United States on climate change? I mean, how do they unfold over the next few years, given that we've heard some pretty belligerent rhetoric coming out of the United States over the past few months and years?
Well, from multilateral perspective, I think, we've been on the track. COP28, Dubai, we got this consensus already. We made new commitments in terms of, tripling renewable energy and improving energy efficiency, transition away from fossil fuels, blah, 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 all those sort of commitments already on the paper now. Getting into COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, the focus will be on finance. So we'll see how things will go out, will come out through the process. A lot of negotiations already happening leading up to COP29. And then, of course, by COP23, 30th in Brazil, and hopefully somehow global community, the parties will be able to officially adopt a new sort of action plan leading up to 2035 in a much elevated sort of level of ambition, particularly against the backdrop actually of the intensifying heat waves and climate disasters there. Now, on the bilateral front, and U.S.-China somehow are, I wouldn't say probably in a way, stuck in a situation because of the bilateral geopolitical situations there. So now if you look at the reality, yes, we'll still keep the conversation going, and particularly through the climate envoys. And they've been, they're going to visiting each other, they've been visiting each other, talking to each other. But in terms of really substance perspective, how the two countries can really work together very productive, constructively, there's a huge question mark. But on the surface there, I think the two were the largest economies and largest emitters decided that somehow they need to somehow demonstrate to the community, global community, that they are serious about, collaboration to support the global process there. So fingers crossed. And to what extent the two countries will really take a more responsible attitude and a position and behave in terms of really supporting the global process. In the meantime, really working closely together to drive through solutions, particularly accelerating clean energy transition. Again, I said a big question mark on the table, fingers crossed.
Sweta, looking at another part of the world, temperatures are also rising at alarming rates in western India. That includes the Delhi capital territory as well. Very densely populated area. We have lots of people in India, in that part of India, other parts of India, who are also working in the construction industry, also working in agriculture. They work out in the open. We talked about food prices earlier on. How is that country being affected?
Yes, and these are some of the most vulnerable people that are actually not just outside for many hours a day being exposed to this heat, but they're conducting strenuous activity. And the impact on these individuals, many of us think we're being unaffected, but the reality is that we are part of a shared ecosystem, and our food supply relies on these different food belts to be able to supply human needs around the world. And so it's absolutely critical that we recognize the plights of these vulnerable populations. India is not another country. We are one globe. And the most consequential impact that will determine whether or not we overcome this climate crisis or not is voting in future President Harris. So the next 4 years actually has an environmental leader in these multilateral negotiations.
Okay, Bob Ward, very quickly, I've got 30 seconds. I want to talk about something that's taking place right now. It's the Summer Olympics in Paris. Are these rising temperatures affecting the athletes there?
Yes, you can see that the temperatures reach 36 degrees Celsius in Paris. We talk about something called the wet bulb temperature, which is if you have temperatures of 35 degrees and 100% humidity, the body cannot cool down through sweating. And so if you're healthy and you're exerting yourself, including athletes, you're at risk. So they are at risk, and let's hope we don't see anybody who really suffers in the heat over the next week.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C.